Odon, back again. I've got some more questions. Now we're moving into questions concerning Muhammad, the character Muhammad, the standard Islamic narrative character Muhammad. This is the guy that that we're all following today. How did he get created? How and why did he get created? Is the questions are, and I'm gonna probably the best way is to. There's so many people that have asked this, but you have chosen really two that you like to answer. One by Pence, one, and the other by Nunu. So let's start with Pence one, and his question is, Pfander, it's obvious now that Muhammad was just a later creation, but why do you think that he in particular was chosen to be the prophet of this new religion? Why not just choose someone who is not a warlord? And then we have Nunu, who continues that idea. If someone accepts your chronic Nazarene hypothesis, Odon, how can he make sense of the massive amount of literature about Muhammad in the Sirah, that's the biography, in the Hadith, that's the sayings, and how did Muslims suddenly come to strongly believe in such a person if he never really existed as per the Islamic standard narrative, the SIN?
Mm-hmm.
Over to you.
Okay. I think in order to understand this, one has to understand the big picture of the creation of Islam, the process which made Islam. We said it in previous videos. Islam did not come first. At first, there was something else, which was not Islam, which was pre-Islamic. There were actual, real historical events. For example, the Nazarene teaching, the Nazarene-Arab alliance, the conquest of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of Jerusalem temple, the warring among the Arab leaders, and a caliph emerged from this process, Abdul Malik. He claimed to be the ruler of God's kingdom on earth, and thereafter came the Abbasids, and the Abbasids wanted also to be the rulers of God's kingdom on earth, but they had to invent something more to justify their power, and so they invented a divine revelation. And so they needed a prophet to
hang it on. You have to have a prophet. Prophets give us revelation. You have to create a prophet.
Exactly. If you have a revelation, you have to have a prophet, you have to have a book, and then you have to have a place of origin and so on. But you see, the thing is that the Abbasid could not invent their religion from scratch because events occurred. There was already a past, and they had to make their religion with what they had. They had texts from which they made the Quran. They had buildings, for example, like the Dome of the Rock, and they could not destroy this building because it did not fit the narrative. They had to invent a narrative that would fit both their own purposes and also what really existed. You see, when you invent a religion from scratch, look at, for example, at the Mormons. The Mormons invented the holy book from scratch, and it fitted the narrative. Even though there are many flaws in this book, this is not the issue here, their book was made in order to justify Mormonism. But the Quran comes from pre-Islamic text. And it is not per se an Islamic text. It has to be forced into an Islamic text. And this was made by creating the standard Islamic narrative, which gives an Islamic meaning to every verse. And this is why the story of Muhammad is so luxuriant, is so full of anecdotes about what he did on this day and so on, in order to give an Islamic reading of every verse. This is what French scholar Henri Lamens, at the beginning of the 20th century, already established. He established that the standard Islamic narrative, the Sirah, the Hadith, the Islamic tradition, was not written to give an historical account of what happened, but to give a sort of Islamic exegesis of what the Abbasid had in their hands. This is why it is so big, because you have to invent something enormous to make something that is not Islamic into something Islamic. So then why the Muhammad character in particular? This has all to do with adapting an actual historical reality into an Islamic so-called reality. There were people in the 7th century nicknamed Muhammad, or who bore the title, the Muhammad title. And the Muhammad title passed upon the Caliph. It was a very complex process. We did many videos with Jays about coins and epigraphy, explaining how the Caliph chose the first Caliph, Abdul Malik, and his successor, and even after the Umayyad, how they choose the Muhammad titles for themselves, and how they use the Muhammad word to justify their powers. So during the Abbasid times, the scribes and their masters, the Caliph masters, had to use, they were kind of forced into using the Muhammad reference. And this is why they were compelled to do with the Muhammad from the 7th century. And this is why we have in the Islamic narrative some tradition that are actually historical, that still convey an historical truth about the historical Muhammad. For example, a hadith tells us that Muhammad was announcing the imminent coming of the Messiah, which contradicts the Islamic narrative. But they had to do with it. And so they made their prophet out of a bit of historical memory, some parts of historical memory, some collective memories that could not be erased. And they made him with the invention of the Islamic narrative in order to give an Islamic meaning to the Quran and to the remains of the 7th century, such as, for example, the Dome of the Rock. This is why they invented the night journey. The night journey is a justification of the Dome of the Rock.
Night journey is the Miraj. Just so people know what you're saying. The night journey.
This is the name in English, the night journey. Isn't it, Jay?
Yeah, I'm just making sure, because most people, with their accent there was a little bit strong. People would not know what you're saying. The journey by night.
The journey by night, exactly. The journey by night, the Isra and Miraj from Mecca to Jerusalem up into the heavens. And this gives its holiness to its Islamic holiness to the city of Jerusalem. Otherwise, in the standard Islamic narrative, there would be no reason for Jerusalem to be a holy place, because it is not supposed to be the place of Abraham. It's supposed to be Mecca and so on. So you see how the Muhammad character was invented from parts of actual history, from the need for the Islamic narrative to give an Islamic meaning to what really existed, and also from something else, which is the need for the need to justify the Caliph's conduct, the Caliph's the Caliph, what the Caliph did. For example, the Caliph had opponents. They had cartoonists, for example, or singers or poets who criticized them. And by inventing stories about Muhammad having his opponents, his caricaturists killed, they could justify killing their actual opponents from the 8th or 9th century. And we have stories in the Islamic tradition about caliphs having their scribes write stories about Muhammad in order to justify their own conduct. So you see the Muhammad prophet character in Islam, in the Islamic tradition, is a very, very odd character because it is a tiny bit part historical, a big part Islamic, and also it reflects what the caliphs were.
Well,
so this is yes, Jay, excuse me.
Oh, go ahead, conclude. So,
but this is almost a pure creation, because the historical part in Muhammad's Islamic character, it's like in a legend. You have some very you have an historical background, but it is very, very remote, and you have a construction, something artificial. In a sense, Muhammad, the Islamic Muhammad is like Robin Hood or Santa Claus, or you see, it relies on something historical. Santa Claus is supposed to be Saint Nicholas, but the Santa Claus from Coca-Cola is very, very different from the Saint Nicholas of Christian traditions. It's the same for Robin Hood or King Arthur. This is how legendary figures are made. And in Islam, there is those two main reasons for the creation of Muhammad. He had to exist in order to justify Islam, and so many stories were invented in order to do so. And he also was a justification for the behavior of the caliphs, and so many stories were invented like this also.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much. This helps. So the need for Muhammad, if I can encapsulate it into 5 areas that I hear you bring up. The first one was, you need to have a prophet, because the Jews and the Christians have a prophetic line. You're the Arabs, you don't have that prophetic line. You're the Ishmaelites, you come from another line. Therefore, you've got to create a prophet in that line. And therefore, to get theological, religious legitimacy, which you don't have yet, you need to create that prophet. Now, of course, once you have the prophet, then what comes with that, then comes the Quran. You need to have a revelation to him. But what was fascinating is the second area that you go on, much of the Quran was now in place, and yet most of it did not really reflect who your prophet is. So you've got to impose your prophet onto all those places, and that's why the standard Islamic narrative took so long to write. You notice it only appears in the 9th century. Why was this not in the 7th century? If the Quran was there, why is it all and I've asked this question for 26 years. Why did it take 200 years and 300 years to get this written down? We can now see it took that long to impose. And you mentioned that, number 3, that there was a lot of historical baggage already there. You gave the example of the Dome of the Rock. The historical baggage, that you can't destroy the Dome of the Rock, so you impose a narrative onto the Dome of the Rock. And the narrative is, this is where Muhammad went to the 7 heavens. We look at the Dome of the Rock today and you say, this has nothing to do with the Miraj. None of the inscriptions talk about the Miraj. It had nothing to do with a man named Muhammad going up to the 7 heavens. It had everything to confronting the Monophysite Byzantine Christianity of the day. It was a theological reason and a political reason that they built that dome there, because it's right smack dab in the middle of Jerusalem, which is the holy of holies for the Jews, and looking down on the Church of the Sepulchre for the Christians. So it had a political statement. It was a religious statement. So the narrative then had to be created to make sense of that building, because you couldn't get rid of the building. So what do? You create the Miraj. Brilliant example. Thanks for that. But then you go on and you say that they needed the caliphs, who now had their own legitimacy. They needed, and many of them who were there in the 7th century actually took that title for themselves, the praised one. Abdul Malik possibly doing. We even think that sometimes even Muawiyah may have used that
Coveted
title.
one.
They say
one,
the what?
Coveted one, the one who is to be loved, adored.
All of these. This is the one who was elevated above all others. And so that's why it already was there. It was well known. It's part of the narrative. It's part of the historical baggage that came from the Umayyad period. The Abbasids then grabbed that name and they made it into a man himself. But once you make it into a man, you've got to give him some backstory. You've got to give him some history. You've got to put meat onto him. And what do? You create all these sayings, you create all the references, and you place them in a place called Mecca, in this place. That's going to be a question that's coming up yet. And then what you then do, then you start putting all these stories to help you understand what the Quran is saying. And you gave the example, and I thought that was interesting, not only of the Miraj, which it can only be found possibly in chapter 17, verse 1, which still doesn't make sense historically. But then you gave the example of the, and this is the last thing you brought into it, is for the caliphs themselves, they needed to have legitimacy. And so what better way to give themselves legitimacy than tagging or hanging onto Muhammad areas that they had problems with, like criticism, something as simple as criticism. People were criticizing them. Well, what do? Well, let Muhammad be criticized and see what Muhammad did to criticism. He killed those who criticized him, like Asma bint Marwan, which is in the Sirah, which is in Ibn Hisham's Sirah. He has her killed by Umar, who stabs her through the heart. And it says, blessed be him for having killed this woman. So that gives you legitimacy to then shut down your critics, because Muhammad is that model. Muhammad is that paradigm that you can follow. So it gives you legitimacy both politically and gives you legitimacy also theologically, and gives Islam legitimacy. That, to me, that would make sense. And so you can see then why now all of this took 200 to 300 years to finally put together. Possibly begun by Ibn Ishaq in 765. 70 years later, there is an awful lot more that they had learned and realized they needed. So they did away with Ibn Ishaq and let Ibn Hisham write the standard Islamic narrative on his life. And Ibn Hisham says, listen, I just took
even Ibn Hisham's Sirah, even Ibn Hisham's story about Muhammad is criticized as being not that honest. He's not in the Islamic tradition, he is very criticized. You see, even in the 9th century, even with Ibn Hisham, the story was not complete yet.
Yeah, but rather and that's infighting within as to what the final narrative is going to be. Nonetheless, today, everybody does go back to Ibn Hisham as the text that you go to find out who this prophet, what he did. And listen, I mean, you can look at Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, all the different others who then put together the hadith. Look at the criticism they got. And then, of course, you come with Al-Tabari in the 10th century, who just puts it all out there and says, you choose which one you want, contradiction after contradiction. But this is exactly how a religion written by or created by men, how it evolves, how it works.
Exactly. Well, what is really fascinating is that this discovery has been made more than a century ago by Henri Lamens in particular, but also by others. And that, you see, it's been more than 100 years that we know this. And still we don't understand. Even though it is very, very clear in Henri Lamens' writings. I don't know whether it has been translated into English.
I've got his book right here. I have to pull it out. Give me the date for Henri Lamens so I have it real quickly.
Henri Lamens, I think he died in the 40s. But I'd like here to read the beginning of one of his books, which is called Fatima and the Daughters of Muhammad. And he says everything in 2 or 3 sentences. He wrote, so this is the Google Translate translation from this introduction. He wrote, just like the corpus of the Muslim tradition, the inspiration of the Sirah is first and foremost exegetical. Derived in righteousness from the text of the Quran, the Sirah is intended to serve as a commentary in action. It must translate into precise anecdotes and picturesque anecdotes, the most obscure allusions, the least intelligible innuendo of the verses, hunting down the anonymous, the impersonal, so disconcerting in the reading of the surahs everywhere, so to speak, affix commemorative plaques, multiplies the mention of proper names, dates, so carefully avoided by Muhammad, Abul Qasim, because at the time, Lamans supposed that Muhammad was the author of the Quran. So exegetical in the first instance, the Sirah is then doctrinal, but with more abandonment, with a less ostensible affectation than in the tradition.
Yeah, and that says it. And I think this is something.
He wrapped it up.
Yeah.
Wrapped it up.
So Muhammad really, they had to have a Muhammad. They had to hang their authority, both political and theological, on a person. And once you have taken that person, which was borrowed from the name that was quite popular already in the 7th century and 8th century, once you take that name, you make it into a person. Once you have it into a person, you've got to put him in a place. And once you have the place, you've got to give him a revelation. It all fits to a piece. Listen, this is good. Thanks so much, Odon. Thank you. We're going to continue on and answer more of the questions. If you have any doubts, for those who have written up the questions and who are asking these brilliant questions, like Pence One and Nunu, I hope Odon's answered your question. And if you haven't answered, right at the bottom here on the comments, and we'll try to get back to them in the future. All right. This is Odon and Jay, 3,000 miles apart. Over and out.